They didn't just push her to the edge of the mahogany table. They handed her a cheap, squeaking metal folding chair, while the board members sank into Italian leather. But when the most feared mob boss in New York walked into the room, he didn't sit at the head. He stared at her, looked down at the wobbly metal seat, and traded places with her without a single word. The air inside the executive suite of Meridian Freight Solutions on the 42nd floor of West 42nd Street smelled faintly of cold espresso and stale terror. It was 8:14 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, and the storm outside rattled the reinforced glass panes like a fist demanding entry. Ivy Hayes stood near the edge of the mahogany table, her fingers pressed flat against the cool, polished wood. Her wool cardigan, a practical camel brown, felt too heavy under the oppressive hum of the fluorescent lights. "We need the manifest updated before the morning dock inspections, Ivy," Corporate Liaison Julian Vance said, not bothering to look up from his tablet. He gestured vaguely toward the perimeter of the room. "And grab a seat. We're wrapping up the logistics review." Ivy turned, her eyes scanning the horseshoe of plush, high-backed ergonomic leather chairs that ringed the room. Every single one of them was occupied by a junior executive or an operations manager. As she stepped forward to slide into the narrow gap between a filing credenza and the end of the table, junior partner Greg Miller kicked his foot out, sending a battered, gray metal folding chair skidding across the commercial carpet until it slammed against her shins. "Careful, Ivy. Don't want you cracking the hydraulics on the executive chairs," Greg muttered, a low, snide chuckle rippling through the men to his left. "We had to pull that out of the janitor's closet, special for you. Standard seating specs just weren't built for a frame like yours." The heat rushed up Ivy's neck, blooming hot and prickly across her cheeks. She felt the heavy, undeniable bulk of her own hips pressed against the tight constraint of her pencil skirt, felt every pair of eyes in the room tracking the fullness of her thighs as she navigated the cramped space. Her body was a constant public ledger here, measured, mocked, and boxed out by men who mistook cruelty for wit. She didn't flinch. She didn't drop her gaze. Slowly, deliberately, Ivy reached down, her knuckles brushing the cold, scuffed metal of the folding chair. She unfolded the legs with a sharp, echoing clack that silenced the snickering. The seat was uneven, one leg shorter than the others, wobbling precariously against the uneven weave of the office carpet. She lowered herself onto it, her full weight settling squarely onto the hard steel, keeping her spine rigid and her chin high. "Manifest will be on your desk by midnight, Julian," Ivy said, her voice steady, completely devoid of the tremor they were waiting for. Before Julian could reply, the heavy double doors at the end of the suite didn't just open. They blew inward with a deafening crash that blew out 2 overhead bulbs in a shower of tiny white sparks. Silence swallowed the room whole. A dozen armed men in tailored charcoal suits swarmed the threshold, their movements synchronized, silent, and lethal. They didn't shout. They didn't issue warnings. They simply moved like oil slicks across the floor, clearing corners with HK-MP5 submachine guns held at low ready. And then he walked in. Dante Albacini. The name alone was enough to curdle the blood of every dock worker, from Montauk to Newark. At 38, He was a ghost story told in whispers across lower Manhattan, a man who had inherited a crumbling syndicate and turned it into an ironclad empire built on blood, concrete, and absolute silence. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, drenched in rain, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His dark hair was slicked back from a face carved from granite, sharp jawline shadowed by a day's worth of dark stubble, and eyes the color of a winter ocean, empty, bottomless, and terrifyingly cold. Julian Vance dropped his tablet. It clattered against the mahogany table, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of black glass. Mr. Albacini, Julian stammered, scrambling backward so fast his leather chair tipped over, sending him sprawling onto the carpet. We weren't expecting. The warehouse shipments aren't until. Dante didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the trembling executives, who immediately pressed themselves flat against the drywall, hands raised in frantic surrender. Dante's cold, unblinking gaze swept across the room and locked directly onto the corner, onto Ivy. She sat frozen on the cheap, squeaking metal folding chair, her hands resting flat on her knees. The contrast was visceral. The terrifying apex predator of the New York underworld standing in a room full of cowering executives, looking dead at the plus-size assistant sitting on industrial trash. Dante took 2 slow, measured steps forward. The rubber soles of his Italian leather shoes made a soft squeak on the damp carpet. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. With agonizing slowness, Dante reached down, grabbed the back of a $3,500 Herman Miller ergonomic leather chair belonging to the terrified senior partner nearest him, and dragged it across the floor. The wheels groaned in protest. He didn't sit in it. Instead, Dante stopped right in front of Ivy. He looked down at the wobbly gray metal folding chair beneath her, then up at her face, not with pity, not with disgust, but with a sudden, searing intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Without a single word, Dante reached out, placed his large, calloused hand on the backrest of her folding chair, and pulled it backward, sliding it out from under her with a smooth, practiced motion. Ivy gasped, her body instinctively shifting weight to catch herself, but Dante's free hand shot out with blinding speed. His fingers wrapped securely, firmly around her upper arm, his grip impossibly strong, yet controlled so precisely that it didn't bruise. He hoisted her up effortlessly, stabilizing her as the metal chair clattered away behind them. Before a single person in the room could draw breath, Dante Albacini picked up the expensive, plush, leather executive chair he had dragged over, set it down precisely where the folding chair had been, and gestured toward it with a curt, commanding tilt of his chin. "Sit," Dante said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated straight through the floorboards. Ivy stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked from the plush leather seat to Dante's face. The terrifying Mafia boss was staring right back at her, his jaw tight, a faint scar running along his left temple, pulsing with a hidden, violent tension. She didn't move. The silence in the suite was absolute, broken only by the heavy patter of rain against the glass and the ragged breathing of Julian Vance, bleeding on the floor. The scent of ozone, damp wool, and expensive sandalwood hung heavy in the narrow aisle between the mahogany credenzas. Ivy didn't sit immediately. Her pulse drummed a frantic rhythm in her ears, her boots planted firmly on the industrial carpet. She looked down at the plush leather executive chair Dante had placed for her, then back up at his cold, slate-gray eyes. "I don't take charity," Ivy said, her voice dropping an octave, steadying itself against the sheer gravity of the man standing inches away. Especially not from a ghost. A flicker of something dangerous and entirely unexpected crossed Dante's face. It wasn't anger. It was a sharp, piercing flash of recognition, like a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut for 20 years. His grip on his coat lapel tightened until his knuckles turned bone white. "It's not charity," Dante murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp meant only for her ears. "It's correction." Before Ivy could process the cryptic weight of his words, Dante turned his back on her with absolute terrifying indifference to the armed men and cowering executives in the room. He walked over to Julian Vance, who was still half-sprawled on the floor, clutching his bleeding nose where he had caught it on the edge of a filing cabinet during his panicked retreat. "Get up, Julian," Dante said softly, stepping over the executive's outstretched legs with the casual grace of a panther. Julian scrambled upward, his knees knocking together so violently his trousers swished audibly. "Mr. Albacini, please, we've handled the Brooklyn docks, just like you asked. The cargo from Palermo cleared customs at dawn." "The cargo cleared," Dante interrupted, his voice chillingly smooth. He pulled a silver-plated cigarette case from his inner coat pocket, flipped it open with his thumb, but didn't light anything. He just rolled a single, unlit cigarette between his fingers. "The cargo cleared, Julian, but the manifest didn't match the weight, short by 4 tons of reinforced titanium alloy. Now, I know my math isn't great, Julian, but titanium doesn't evaporate in the rain. Where is it?" Julian's face drained of every drop of color until he looked like curdled milk. He shot a frantic, pleading glance across the room, not toward his armed guards, not toward his terrified partners, but directly toward the quiet corner where Ivy stood by the leather chair. Ivy's eyes narrowed. The discrepancy. That was the phantom file she had flagged. 3 weeks ago, the one Julian had ordered her to shred, threatening her with immediate termination if she ever spoke of it to the board. "She knows," Julian blurted out suddenly, pointing a trembling, manicured finger straight at Ivy. Panic had stripped away every ounce of his corporate bravado. "She runs the digital audit logs. She bypassed the secondary encryption. She has the missing records on her private server." Every head in the room snapped toward Ivy. The silence grew so heavy it felt radioactive. 2 of Dante's enforcers immediately pivoted, their submachine guns swinging halfway in her direction, fingers sliding lazily toward the triggers. Ivy didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back into the shadows or try to make herself smaller. She straightened her shoulders, letting her full, heavy frame stand unmasked and unapologetic in the harsh glare of the remaining fluorescent lights, her gaze locking onto Dante's with unflinching defiance. "I flagged an unauthorized data wipe," Ivy said clearly, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. "If Julian is missing 4 tons of titanium, it's because he diverted the shipping containers to a private dry dock in Red Hook under a shell company." I have the digital ledger right here. She tapped her temple with 2 fingers and encrypted backups in 3 off-site locations that auto-publish to federal investigators if my heart stops beating for more than 12 hours. Julian made a choking sound, his eyes bulging. You lying bitch? Bang. The sound wasn't a gunshot. It was the flat, brutal crack of the butt of a Sig Sauer pistol striking Julian across the temple, delivered by one of Dante's enforcers without breaking a sweat. Julian crumpled to the floor like a sack of wet laundry, unconscious before he hit the carpet. Dante didn't even blink. He slowly pocketed his silver cigarette case, turned on his heel, and walked straight toward Ivy. He stopped so close she could smell the rain and cedar on his wool coat, could see the tiny, jagged scar tracing the edge of his jawline. For 3 agonizing seconds, Dante said nothing. He just looked down at her, really looked at her, taking in the defiance in her chin, the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the unapologetic reality of her plus-size frame standing tall against a man who made billionaires weep. "What's your name, assistant?" Dante asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Ivy Hayes." Dante's eyes flicked down to her badge, then back up, a dark, turbulent storm brewing beneath his gaze. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a heavy, crushed mahogany velvet box, and flipped the lid open with one long finger. Inside rested an antique gold signet ring, bearing a crest Ivy hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. The Moretti family crest, long thought buried in the wreckage of a bloody dock war in 2004. "Ivy Hayes," Dante whispered, the name tasting like ash and old blood on his tongue. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand, sending a sudden, electric shock race up her arm. "You aren't an assistant. Not to these rats. You're Lorenzo Moretti's blood. And tonight, you're coming with me." The rain hammered against the reinforced armored glass of the black Cadillac Escalade as it cut through the desolate industrial arteries of the Bronx. Inside the leather-lined cabin, the air smelled of cold gunmetal, expensive bourbon, and the faint, citrus trace of Dante's cologne. Ivy sat on the opposite bench seat, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly over the heavy wool of her camel cardigan, her thighs pressed firmly against the leather cushion, filling the space with the undeniable, solid weight of her body, a reality that the 2 armed enforcers flanking her in the back seat seemed entirely willing to accommodate, their broad shoulders brushing against her coat with every violent sway of the goat. Soon. Dante sat across from her, his long legs stretched out, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the 42nd floor offices of Meridian Freight Solutions 15 minutes ago. The antique mahogany velvet box rested on his lap, the lid still open, exposing the heavy gold Moretti signet ring that gleamed dully under the dim overhead amber light. "You're awfully quiet, Ivy." Dante finally broke the silence, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that cut through the low hum of the engine. Most women find themselves kidnapped by a mafia boss and they scream, or cry, or bargain for their lives. Ivy turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his without a flicker of fear. "Screaming wastes oxygen, crying ruins your makeup, and bargaining with a man who hits harder than the problems I'm already dealing with is a waste of time." She shifted her weight, making full, unapologetic use of her space on the bench. Besides, Julian Vance was a coward who liked to remind me every Tuesday that I didn't fit into his corporate aesthetic. Seeing him hit the floor with a bloody nose wasn't a kidnapping, Mr. Albacini. It was a public service. A faint, ghostly twitch pulled at the corner of Dante's mouth. Not a smile, but the acknowledgement of a predator recognizing teeth in unexpected places. He closed the mahogany box with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet cabin. Julian was a pawn, Dante said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. A middle manager laundering stolen inventory through a shell company owned by my uncle. Except Adrian didn't just steal 4 tons of titanium. He stole something belonging to the Moretti estate. Something you've been sitting on since your father's funeral 20 years ago. Ivy's breath hitched just for a fraction of a second, but she caught it, locking her jaw tight. My father was a dock worker who died in a crane accident when I was 8 years old. He didn't leave an estate. He left an eviction notice and a mountain of debt. Your father was Lorenzo Moretti, Dante corrected, his voice dropping into a register so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. And the crane accident was a car bomb planted by my own blood to seize control of the North River shipping lanes. They thought they wiped out the entire bloodline. They didn't know Lorenzo hid his digital cold storage keys inside the physical mechanics of an old office typewriter. The same typewriter his favorite corporate assistant used before she vanished. You weren't an ordinary hire at Meridian, Ivy. You infiltrated Adrian's inner circle 6 months ago. You just got caught in the crossfire of his corporate restructuring before you could pull the trigger on him. The revelation hit Ivy like a physical blow. All those late nights spent decrypting server logs, all those microaggressions from Greg Miller about her size, all those moments she thought she was just a bullied plus-size assistant trying to survive in a ruthless city. It was all a chessboard she had willingly walked onto. How did you know? Ivy whispered, her voice finally betraying a fraction of the raw, trembling emotion beneath her armor. Because, Dante said softly, reaching out to slide the mahogany box across the leather console toward her knees, you have your mother's eyes, and she was the only woman in New York who ever looked me in the eye and told me my suit looked cheap. The Escalade slowed down, its heavy tires crunching over loose gravel before coming to a complete halt inside a massive, dimly lit subterranean warehouse off East 135th Street. The metal security shutters rolled down behind them with a deafening crash, sealing them in the dark underbelly of the city. The concrete floor of the Albacini stronghold was damp and freezing, smelling sharply of motor oil, damp earth, and old rust. Dante stepped out of the Escalade first, his tall, imposing frame cutting an intimidating silhouette against the flickering, overhead sodium lamps. He pulled open the rear door and offered a gloved hand down toward Ivy. She looked at his hand, large, calloused, marked by the quiet violence of a life spent at war, and then looked past him. 10 yards away, tied securely to a heavy steel pillar with industrial zip ties, sat Detective Arthur Briggs. The corrupt internal affairs officer looked battered, his face swollen on the left side, his blue police jacket torn at the shoulder. Behind him stood Adrian Moretti, gray-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit his hands tucked casually into his pockets, despite the two submachine guns pointed directly at his chest by Albacini enforcers. Ivy ignored Dante's hand, sliding across the leather bench and planting both boots firmly on the cold concrete. She stood at her full height, her plus-size frame commanding space despite the damp chill biting through her wool cardigan. "Well, well, well," Adrian Moretti drawled, a thin, venomous smile spreading across his thin lips as his eyes landed on Ivy. "If it isn't the little office drone, I always wondered why Julian kept such a heavy, sluggish girl around the executive floor. Turns out you were just a rat with a family pedigree." Ivy didn't flinch. She took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward, stopping directly beside Dante, shoulder to shoulder with the most feared mob boss in New York. "You killed my father, Uncle," Ivy said, her voice steady, ringing clearly off the hollow brick walls. "And you spent 20 years running a stolen empire on blood money you couldn't even launder clean." Adrian let out a harsh, barking laugh. "And what are you going to do about it, niece? Shoot me? You've spent your whole life hiding behind spreadsheets and enduring fat jokes from mid-level accountants. You don't have the stomach for this world." Before Ivy could answer, Dante stepped forward. His movement was so fast it was a blur. He drew his matte black Sig Sauer P 226 with one fluid motion and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against Adrian's forehead. The warehouse went dead silent. Even the dripping water pipes seemed to hold their breath. "She doesn't need to have the stomach for it, Adrian," Dante whispered, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with decades of pent-up rage. "Because I've been keeping a stomachache warm for you since 2004. Adrian's smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, frantic sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Dant, wait, we're family. The Albacini Moretti pact. The pact died when you blew up my father's car," Dante interrupted coldly. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he lowered the barrel slightly, pistol whipping Adrian across the jaw with enough force to send the older man crashing sideways into the concrete, spitting blood and broken teeth. Dante turned his head toward Ivy, his slate-gray eyes softening just a fraction, revealing the deep, bleeding wound of a man who had finally found the piece of his soul he thought was buried forever. "The cold storage keys, Ivy," Dante said quietly, his hand extending the mahogany box toward her. "Open the vault. Let's finish what your father started." The heavy steel vault door at the back of the subterranean bunker swung open with a deep, hydraulic groan, revealing rows of gleaming titanium crates and stacked bearer bonds, totaling $45 million. The amber emergency lights cast long, dramatic shadows across the concrete floor, bathing the room in a warm, sepia glow. Ivy stood in the center of the vault, the vintage, mechanical typewriter her father had left her, resting on a steel crate before her. Her fingers, steady and precise, flew across the glass-capped, mechanical keys, punching in the cryptographic sequence she had memorized when she was 8 years old, the final override that transferred every cent of the Moretti Albacini syndicate assets into an untouchable, independent trust bearing her name. Behind her, Dante leaned against the steel doorframe, watching her with an intensity that burned hotter than the warehouse heaters. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, exhausted silence over the city. "Done," Ivy said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling servers. She stood up straight, rolling her shoulders back, feeling the solid, unapologetic weight of her own power for the first time in her life. She turned around to face him. The accounts are locked. Adrian is heading to a federal penitentiary courtesy of Detective Briggs' confession, and Meridian Freight is officially under my operational control. Dante pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly toward her until he was standing just inches away. Up close, she could see the raw exhaustion etched into the fine lines around his eyes, the heavy price of a crown forged in fire. "And what happens to the assistant?" Dante asked, his voice dropping to a rough, vulnerable whisper. "Now that you own the empire, do you still need the folding chair?" Ivy looked up at him, a slow, knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth. She reached out, her warm fingers lightly brushing the lapel of his damp wool coat right over his heart. "No," Ivy murmured, her eyes locked on his. "I think I'll take the leather seat this time, and you're going to sit right next to me." Dante didn't answer with words. He reached out, his strong, calloused hands resting securely on her waist, pulling her forward into an embrace that felt less like a surrender and more like the end of a long, brutal war. The heavy silence inside the Escalade was punctuated only by the rhythmic beat of the windshield wipers, clearing away the remnants of the storm. Dante kept his eyes locked on the dark, wet asphalt stretching ahead of them, his thumb absently tracing the edge of the mahogany velvet box resting between them. 20 years is a long time to carry a ghost, Ivy, Dante said, his voice dropping into a register so quiet it barely registered over the purr of the V8 engine. "When the bomb went off outside your father's townhouse on East 68th Street, they told me everyone was gone. They told me the bloodline was pruned clean so the Albacini syndicate could consolidate the port authorities without interference." Ivy shifted slightly against the leather bench, her gaze fixed on the reflection of the city lights shimmering across the armored window glass. "They miscalculated," she said softly. "My mother managed to push me out of the nursery window into the garden. Just 3 seconds before, the blast wave shattered the glass. A loyal family driver found me in the bushes, wrapped me in a wool blanket, and drove straight into Pennsylvania under an assumed name. No money, no protection, just a gold signet ring sewn into the lining of a winter coat, and a warning that if anyone ever found out who I was, I'd end up like the rest of them. And instead of hiding in the countryside, you came straight back into the lion's den." Dante noted, a dark, dangerous edge returning to his voice. "You spent 6 months working as an administrative assistant under Adrian's own roof, taking orders from corrupt middle managers who treated you like furniture, all just to crack their offline servers." "Survival isn't a spectator sport, Dante," Ivy replied, turning her head to meet his gaze directly. "If you want to tear down a concrete wall, you don't use a sledgehammer on day 1. You find the hairline fracture in the mortar, you wedge your fingers into the crack, and you wait until the whole structure collapses under its own weight. Julian Miller and Adrian Moretti thought my size made me slow. They thought my quiet desk made me harmless. They never bothered to look at what my fingers were doing on the keyboard while they were busy dividing up stolen shipping containers." Dante's chest rose and fell in a slow, deep breath. the raw, unapologetic strength radiating from her. A woman who had weaponized her own invisibility in a world ruled by violent men sent a jolt straight through his chest. It wasn't pity. It was total, unreserved reverence. The subterranean bunker beneath East 135th Street was cavernous, smelling sharply of wet stone, high-grade explosives, and the metallic tang of fear. Detective Arthur Briggs thrashed against the industrial zip ties, binding his wrists to the steel pillar, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. "Albacini, listen to me." Briggs choked out as Dante's heavy boots echoed across the damp concrete floor. "I was just following the manifest logs." Adrian said the Federal Internal Affairs audit was already cleared. If this story showed you that true power isn't about fitting someone else's mold, and that the strongest queens rise from the very corners people tried to push them into, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment between Ivy and Dante, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another heart-pounding tale of fierce loyalty, redemption, and undeniable romance. What would you have done in her place?